This is section 10.3, part 2. We're talking about the difference between a rational number and an irrational number. I've written up here are three different ways to define a rational number, either as a fraction, repeating decimal, or a terminating decimal. For example, we could have 0.333333 repeating, or a terminating decimal such as 0.75, or any fraction. An irrational number, in comparison, is a non-repeating decimal, and it's also non-terminating. For example, the square root of a non-perfect square, or pi. So, as we look at these four examples below, we want to determine whether or not they're rational or irrational. The easiest way with square roots is to look at the number inside. If you remember, that's called the radicand. And we say to ourselves, is that square root, or is that number inside a perfect square? Well, it's not. So this number is irrational. Let's look at part B. When you have a square with a fraction, both the top and the bottom both be perfect squares, and they are. 1 squared is 41, and 7 squared is 49. And so since this can be reduced to 1/7, it's a rational number. Our next one, 0.06. As we learned from our decimals and our approximations on the previous page, 6 is not a perfect square, so this one is irrational. And our last one, 1/7, neither are, while the 1 is a perfect square, the 7 is not, and so this one is also irrational. Now I'm going to ask you a question. Let's look at this one. Is the square root of 42 rational or irrational? Hopefully you said that's not a perfect square, so that's an irrational number. We'll do more examples later. Now, our next one we're going to talk about estimating. To our right, I've written down a column of our perfect squares all the way up through 12. Well, let's do a couple more. 13 squared is 169, and 14 squared is 196. And as we look at these perfect squares, the question is, where does the square root of 50 lie? Well, it's in between 49 and 64. And so the square root of 50 is in between 7 and 8 as an estimation. Where's 172 lie? Well, that's in between 169 and 196. And so the square root of 172 is between 13 and 14. So the idea is you look at what is the radicand and where does it lie in between what two perfect squares. Let's think about 35. Where does it lie? In between 25 and 36. So the square root is between 5 and 6. The square root of 12 is a little bit smaller. That's in between 9 and 16. So it's in between 3 and 4 as an answer. Our bottom section down here, we're just going to be talking about using our calculator to estimate our square roots as we talk about the idea of reducing to a number where we round it to the nearest hundredth. So as we're looking at this here, we're going to use our calculator and we're going to reduce this to the nearest hundredth. And in so doing, I also want to show you how to use our calculators in such a way that we can not only take the square root with the square root button, we can also do it another way. First, let's do it just using the square root button. The square root of 159. Well, that's 12.6. And rounded to the nearest hundredth, that's 12.61. Because obviously the 609 rounds up. Now, I want to also show you we can raise this to the 1/2 or 0.5. Raising something to the 0.5 is also a way to think about a square root being raised to the power of 1/2. So either way, you're going to get the same answer. So let's try for the next one. Remember, a minus sign out front is going to be applied at the end. So I'm going to take 4,169 and raise it to the 1/2. Well, that's 64.57, and I'm going to put that minus sign out front. Let's look at part B over here. We have 11,852. We raise that to the power of 1/2, and we get 108.866, and so that's 0.87 as we round it to the nearest hundredth. Let's look at our last one, 798 raised to the 1/2. That's 28.248, and so that's 28.25. So when we estimate, we can realize we can either take the square root of a number or we can take raising it to the power of 1/2. Hopefully you've learned something new about using your calculator here.